I'm Forrest. I'm a tour guide here at the Stranahan's Whiskey Distillery in the heart of Denver. Come through for a wonderful tour anytime. So the first whiskey we give out is Blue Peak. Blue Peak is our youngest and lowest proof American single malt, aged for at least 4 years and then finished using something called the Solera method, which we'll talk more about when we get back into the rack house and make a bit more sense and see those barrels in action. All you really need to know now is that Blue Peak was designed to be a good entry point. That's what we do here at Stranahan's. Sometimes call it our welcome whiskey or our gateway whiskey. We've got one poured right up here. You can come on up, grab a glass, and then we'll get started. So I always start my tours talking about the category, right? So whiskey is the big umbrella term. Whiskey includes bourbon, as well as Scotch whiskey, rye whiskey, Irish whiskey, Canadian whiskey, all that jazz. The American part of the equation is fairly obvious. It's made in the U.S., but it's worth specifying that. Even if we made our whiskey just like single malt Scotch, and we don't, we couldn't call it single malt Scotch since we're not in Scotland. So we just specify the whole piece, American single malt we're talking about. And the basics of single malt really two things. Single is one single distillery. Everything happens right here. Malt refers to the grain, meaning that we're made from 100% malted barley. Compared with bourbon, bourbon is going to be at least 51% corn. Usually there's more to it. There's rye or there's wheat, and sometimes some malted barley too. And that is the only grain that we use. You'll see pictures all over a building of this cowboy-looking fella up here. His name is not Stranahan. His name is Jess Graber. So he went into business with a man named George Stranahan. They met out in Woody Creek, Colorado, in the mountains outside of Aspen. When Jess was living out that way, he's a jack-of-all-trades type guy. He's a construction worker, a volunteer firefighter, also an illegal moonshiner. Now, George Stranahan, on the other hand, he had a good bit of money at the time. He owned a large ranch out that way called Flying Dog Ranch, and he really liked to brew beer. So the story is, at the fire one day on George Stranahan's ranch, Jess is on duty. He answers the call, helps George put out a fire. As a way of saying thanks, George said, "Hey, let me give you some of this beer I've been brewing." And what Jess does, besides, drinking a good share of the beer, he set some of it aside and he distilled it. So he made a moonshine out of George Stranahan's beer. He said, "This is really good. We should go into business together." And at first, George Stranahan actually said, "No thanks, I'm just focusing on the beer." But Woody Creek is a very small, one-bar kind of town that keeps running into each other. They kind of become drinking buddies. Eventually, Jeff decides to give George that pitch one more time, but sweeten the deal. So he says, "George, what about this? What if you make the big business decisions, and I'll take care of all the operational stuff? And what if I name the distillery after you? We'll call it Stranahan's." And here we are. We opened in 2004, and a fun trivia fact, when we opened, we were the very first legal distillery in Colorado since Prohibition, which we're very proud of. It's been a huge boom in distilling. We're kind of ahead of the curve. Last I heard, we're at almost 100 distilleries in Colorado, and literally 21 years ago, we were the very first one. When we first opened, though, we were not right here. We were in lower downtown Denver by Coors Field on Blake Street. We were right next door to George Stranahan's then brewery called Flying Dog Brewing. They would make what's called the wash for us. The first step in the process we'll get into in a moment. They'd pipe that over to us where we would distill it. It worked out real nice until about 2008. George Stranahan gets a good deal on a property in Maryland, and he relocates Flying Dog Brewing to the East Coast. And they're still around today, doing very well for themselves. They're even in the Baltimore airport now. But them moving away and turned out to be good for us. That forced us to get our own space, start doing more things for ourselves. We've been here in this building since 2009. We actually took it over from another brewery called Heavenly Days, which worked out really nice because we could purchase all the equipment you're looking at behind me up through fermentation number 3 from that brewery, giving us a nice big jump start. We've been here ever since, and things are going really well. We're going to wind it back a sec and talk a little bit more about the barley. Because the barley is where it all starts. Since it's just us, turn around, follow me over here real quick. So I said 100% malted barley, but not all barley is the same. After it's malted, it can be toasted. We use 4 different toast levels: pale, caramel, chocolate, and black malt. each have their own flavor profile. With a blend of all those, it gives us our flavor profiles. But it all comes from the Rocky Mountain region, mostly from Colorado. And I'm going to pass the jar around. You guys can have a little smell, try and spot all the different toast levels. Does it remind you guys of anything? Sometimes people tell me cereals or bread. Grain? Yeah, that's right. Other main places we encounter grain going to mean cereal, bread, beer. Now, barley arrives here already malted and toasted. We hand mix in the different toast levels into each batch, so we get our recipe right where we want it to be. This is what it's going to look like coming out of the mill. So it's not milled up super fine like a flour. It's really about cracking that grain open. Now, from the mill, barley is going to travel through this very fancy, super high-tech PVC pipe. You see right there with the duct tape on it. Goes into the mash lauter tun right over there. Now, first few steps in making a whiskey are a lot like making a beer. You always have to ferment before you distill. So if you ever taken a brewery tour or done any home brewing, first few steps seem a little familiar. But in the mash tun, it's just hot water and the barley. We're infusing that water with the flavor of the barley, turning starches into sugars. I think of it like a sweet barley tea. We call that distiller's wort, W-O-R-T. But the barley itself is only going to be in the mash tun for 3 hours. It's going right back out through that metal pipe. But the liquid, the distiller's wort, moving on down the line. So next stop is the boil kettle. Yeah, so we're trying to boil off impurities. Think wild yeast, stuff we don't want in fermentation. From there into the whirlpool. In the whirlpool, we actually shoot the wort in at speed to get a centrifuge effect. All the fine particulates fall to the bottom. We siphon off the good stuff. From there into the fermenters, we add in the yeast. Yeast eats the sugars in the distiller's wort and gives us alcohol. The reason you're all here today. Now, I like to point out this is closed fermentation. These big stainless steel tanks, similar to what you'll see in most breweries. If you ever get the opportunity to visit like a big bourbon distillery, you'll see something different. You'll see these open wooden tanks kind of bubbling away. That's open fermentation, which can allow for a few more natural variables, using yeast in the air. We're very controlling at this point in the process. You think about our roots in craft beer too. We're very particular about brewing and fermentation. We're going to ferment for a week. And that a week, we're just talking 7% alcohol by volume. It's a very beer-like substance. Basically, picture a flat, dark beer, a dark brown ale, almost a porter. It's going to be very malty, because remember, malted barley is the only thing that's in it. And that is the foundation for our flavor profile. Everything we make here starts the exact same way, just a little asterisk unless we're doing something weird and experimental.
And it's 100% malted barley.
Yep, always 100% malted barley. Yep, nothing else. Any other questions?
Can it still be classified as a single malt scotch if it's not 100%, if it's like, we'll say, 70% malted barley, 30% corn?
No, that would be considered a malt whiskey.
Malt whiskey, okay.
So in the way that like rye whiskey needs to be a majority of, rye whiskey needs to be, at least a majority of rye grain. If it is 50% malt, you could still call it malt whiskey. But if it's single malt, you're saying 100% malted barley. That's going to be the designation. In Scotch and Irish whiskey land, you will sometimes see grain whiskeys, and that will mean they're pulling from different grains as well when they're not using the designation of single malt. But even like another interesting terminology, which we'll talk a bit more about when getting back, is blended malt. With Scotch whiskey, that means an independent blender pulling from different distilleries to make something new. It's going to move from the fermenters into these big, beautiful stills. You see behind me, these are a real cool type of still. They're called hybrid stills. A combination of a pot still and a column still. And looking at it, you can figure it out, right? The pot is the bottom part, the column is the top part. Now, pot stills are what they traditionally use for making Irish and Scotch whiskeys, known for giving real good flavor. Lots of rooms that wash, move around at the inside. Pure column stills, on the other hand, can be enormous. I mean like 2 or 3 stories tall. Big enough around you couldn't wrap your arms around them. Those stills are known for their efficiency. We decided we wanted to get the best of both worlds. We actually did custom order our very first one of these stills because they weren't regularly making them. And the basics of distillation is very simple. I can get nerdier about it if you have questions, but the basics, just that alcohol has a lower boiling point than water. We're trying to boil off and collect the alcohol. The fun fact is worth knowing though, the alcohol boils about 168 degrees up here in Denver. And we specify up here in Denver because due to differences in atmospheric pressures, water boils at a different temperature up here in Denver than it does at sea level at 202 as opposed to 212. That affects the boiling point of alcohol. So things actually do work a little bit differently when you're doing them at elevation. Anyone who's ever done baking at altitude can attest to that. But we've got about 800 gallons of wash going into each of these stills. We're just 7% ABV. And then coming out of each of these, we're talking about 140 gallons of a substance that is now totally clear and 80 proof. So we're going from what is basically a dark beer to a clear spirit at 40% alcohol by volume. The smallest alcohol molecules, the first bit to come off the still, that contains stuff you don't want to drink, like methanol. So the heads need to be cut off. Now, tails are the opposite. Heavier, denser alcohol molecules, last bit to come off the still. And the interesting thing with the tails is they are technically drinkable. Anyone who's ever had a wild night involving a too much lower shelf liquor, the inexpensive kind that comes in big plastic jugs, probably imbibed a good bit of tails because tails are technically drinkable. They're also cheaper to produce. But those larger, denser alcohol molecules contain other congeners, so chemical constituents that are literally harder for our bodies to process. That's going to leave us more dehydrated and give us worse hangovers. So we're going to do a pretty conservative cut of the tails as well, which is going to leave us with the hearts, the good stuff. So this is what a lot of people would call white dog, white lightning, or moonshine. The industry term is high wine. You'll sometimes also hear people call it new make spirit. You guys can have a little smell of this if you want. I'll hold the jar for you. But, this is a lot of alcohol. What I like to ask, though, is can you smell anything else? And it's usually just alcohol-related things people tell me it reminds them of. Some people say like tequila or sake, like an agave type of sweetness to it. Some people say it's kind of fruity. Some people say it's kind of floral. So it's come from the yeast we're using in fermentation, giving off nice aromatic esters, as well as the different toast levels of barley. But remember, everything is now concentrated down. This is 140 proof. We're talking 70% alcohol by volume. Now, we can't just put this in a barrel for two reasons. First is this level of alcohol content isn't good for barrels. It would actually degrade them over time. And secondly would be legally. For American whiskey, you can legally only barrel at 125 proof or lower. We have found our kind of sweet spot to get the aging, the reaction that we want lower still. We're going to cut this down to 110 proof before it goes into a barrel, so 55% alcohol by volume. And this is where I like to talk about water. Water doesn't sound that exciting, but it's very important when you're making whiskey, used in three parts. So once, obviously in the very beginning, once here to bring everything down to barreling proof, and then unless you're drinking a whiskey that's labeled cask strength or barrel proof, whiskey actually has water added to it again. Out of the barrels into the bottle until you get to a consistent, regular proof point. Barrels aren't just rolling off at 80 or 90 proof, what have you. And the other point to mention is after all the hard work we're doing of distilling and then aging, we're not just going to cut it down with Denver tap water. We outsource our water from a place called El Dorado Springs. It's a state park about 30 minutes up the road, just outside of Boulder. Actually, the very same water we have in the visitor center and back here as well. They've won awards for their bottled water. Very fancy. That is the water we use at the end to bring everything down to bottling proof. We use it there where we believe it has the biggest impact on the flavor profile. It just goes back to that regionality piece we were touching on in the beginning. With all the barley coming from the Rocky Mountain region, mostly from Colorado, having a super local water source. So we are very much a product of our region. The number one difference you need to know going into the original from Blue Peak is that we're taking a step up in proof. Blue Peak was 86 proof and this is 94 proof. I'll pour a little bit for you right over here. Lead you through a little 4-part guided tasting here. Very important always to smell before you taste. People get really excited about this sometimes and they'll jam their noses like all the way in there. And that's not my recommendation because this is a higher proof alcohol and alcohol can overwhelm your nose. But if the glass is back down a little bit lower, you're actually able to disperse more alcohol vapors. You don't get so much ethanol going right up the nose. For me, on the nose with the original, I get like almost a green apple Jolly Rancher note in there. There's a kind of sweet tart action that happens. Your classic whiskey notes are present as well, things like caramels and vanillas. And people have told me they smell everything in here from fresh cut grass to cantaloupe. So it's lovely seeing the things that people can smell in here. Now, the next step after having a good smell is to taste. I always tell people to start with a very small taste. The first taste isn't really that much of a tasting sip. The first sip, you're really kind of waking up and invigorating the palate a little bit. Now, people also tend to describe the original as a bit of a spicy whiskey. And I like to just unpack that term a bit, because I think when they say that, they're usually not talking about flavor, they're talking about heat. And heat's really interesting. You can feel it different places in different ways. Sometimes you'll get it on the sides of your tongue, sometimes you'll feel heat down the throat, and then there's my personal favorite when it travels all the way down into the chest. In the bourbon world, you'll actually hear people call it a Kentucky hug sometimes. So I like to think of this as a Colorado hug. So you got ready for the second sip. Second sip should be a little bit bigger because your palate has been invigorated a little bit more. And I encourage on the second sip to hold it in the mouth just for a moment. You don't have to swish it around or anything. But the idea is normally when you drink, whiskey kind of shoots across the top of the tongue. If you hold it in your mouth for a moment, you're allowing the whiskey to encounter more parts of the tongue, more parts of the mouth, so you will actually be able to taste more. Now, next step, if you hold your glass up to the light, you'll actually notice the color. All the color in the whiskey comes from the barrel. No color is ever added to Stranahan's. But the other thing is you can see straight through it. It's not cloudy or hazy. So what I have here is a little squirt bottle filled with the very same award-winning spring water I was telling you about. If I apply a little dash of water here and hold that back up to the light, you'll actually see a shimmer, like an oil and water type reaction. It is a little hard to catch on camera, especially in the dim light. But if you go back to the nose, I think you'll actually find it changes. It gets a little bit sweeter and mellower to me. I get an almost floral characteristic.
I get a honey on it.
Yeah, it's more like a maple syrup, butterscotchy thing. And then, if you have a sip, I think you'll find too the flavor, it doesn't disappear, but it softens, it rounds out, it mellows out in a really neat way. So I always encourage people to experiment, to try. I think there is sometimes this notion in the whiskey world that, oh, no, it's bad to water things down or cut it down. I only want strong, blah, 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 blah. And I always encourage people to try something different. And sometimes literally just a drop or two will make a difference. I would say that's always my number one takeaway I want people to have is to try drinking your whiskey a couple different ways and see how you like it. You might like it with a bit of water, you might like it on the rocks, or you might like it neat. I always like to have a neat sip first so I know where my palate is at and where the whiskey is at, and then I decide if I want to add water. We age our whiskey like a bourbon. So if you're making bourbon, you're legally required to age in new charred oak barrels. But remember, we're not bourbon. We chose to age this way for the flavor profiles that we're looking for. The actual law with American single malt, which just recently actually became a category, officially designated back in January by the Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau. It was very exciting. First time there's been a new category of whiskey in the U.S. in over 50 years. Really cool. But the actual wording for American single malt specifies aging in oak barrels. It can be new, they can be used, they can be charred or uncharred. So there's lots of room for experimentation. This means there are other American single malts out there, and you will see more, that are aged differently. Just something to keep in mind. There will be many different kind of flavor profiles within the American single malt whiskey category. But everything that Stranahan says starts off the exact same way. At least 3 years, usually more than that, in new charred oak barrels. The original, for example, is what we call a marriage. It's a mixture, a combination of different ages. The original contains 4 through 8 years Stranahan. So trying to give you the best of an older, best of a younger whiskey, and a little bit of higher proof at 94 proof. But I like to compare charring barrels to caramelized onions. By applying a level of char to the barrel, we're getting more ready access to the caramels and vanillas, this good whiskiness. We are changing the availability of sugar in the first few layers of wood. Get the tilt, you can get a look inside there. So we also don't have very many oak trees out here in Colorado. That is something that you have to import. We get all of our barrels from a place called Independent Stave Company. They're based out of Lebanon, Missouri. They assemble and they char all of our barrels for us. So all of our barrels get a level 3 char on the inside. It means they're held with an open flame for about 35 seconds. A super special barrel right here. Now this barrel used to be full. We filled this barrel in 2013. So this is your indicator for the loss we experienced aging a whiskey here for 12 years. Pretty substantial. I actually did a tour just a month or so ago for somebody who did a tour here in 2014. She showed me a picture of this barrel filled up to here. When I started here about 3.5 years ago, it was up to here. Now, we lose whiskey in two main ways. You may have heard the term the angel share within the industry. Angel share is a neat term. It actually predates distilling. It goes back like monks and monasteries, aging meads, wines, wooden barrels. You'll eventually notice their older barrels had some missing. But you know, they're monks. They all trust each other. So the conclusion they come to is the angels couldn't help themselves, but come down, have a little sip, you know, bless the barrel. But it is what we know today as evaporation. And just think about evaporation a second. Colorado is really dang dry. It can also get pretty hot, peak summertime. But we experience a huge angel share. Like, there are distilleries in Scotland that will cover their barrels and just leave them outside to age. They'll lose maybe 2% a year to their angel share. Real cute. If we were to try that here, we'd lose something wild. I'm talking like upwards of 10% a year, at least to start. Very, very thirsty angels out here. But the other main way we lose whiskey is it gets absorbed into the barrel. Now there's another industry term for this, which I'm technically not supposed to say. So you didn't hear it from me, but the Devil's Cut by Jim Beam, TM. If you look at the side of the stave here, you will see a line though. So this is where a stave is touching another stave in a barrel. What you're seeing is a line of where the whiskey tried to escape the barrel and was caught. This happens because alcohol expands when it gets hot, cools down, contracts, leaves them behind in the barrel when it does that. This is going to happen in big ways seasonally, but in a smaller way, a day-to-day basis in Colorado, where we have these really big swings in temperature. It does not usually have a 30 or 40 plus degree difference between the heat of the day and the cold of the night. That rapid heating and cooling, the climate experiences, causes our whiskey to move in and out of the barrel at a more rapid rate than it does elsewhere. Whiskey literally ages differently here than it does in Kentucky or in Scotland. Really, wherever you are in the world, climate has a huge impact on how whiskey ages.
So if we take one of their barrels that is full, put it outside, you're going to lose upwards of 10% angel share.
Yeah.
In Colorado, in a controlled environment. What would you say it's reduced to by having it in this rick house as opposed to just outside?
You will lose the most in your first couple years, and it's going to kind of gradually go down because your liquid is essentially concentrating over time. What I will also say with that is that we lose water to evaporation mostly, but more so than alcohol. So generally, as we age, our whiskey is going to get stronger in alcohol content. Which can be a good thing and can be a bad thing to a degree. I will also let you know we do have, this building is not climate controlled at all. We do have a second building about 20 feet that way, which is nothing but thousands and thousands of barrels. In there, we do climate control a little bit. Add a little bit of humidity, we just don't want the barrels to dry out too much. What we want to do is little climate control as we can get away with it. We want our whiskey to experience the swings in the Colorado. Now, the other thing is everything starts off this exact same way in the new charred oak. And let's just talk about one of those phrases, new. New means a barrel that hasn't had anything in it before, including our own liquid. So we do not reuse our barrels. And again, this is the way that bourbon works as well. If you're making bourbon, you're legally required to use that new charred oak. Now, barrels wind up all sorts of places. Breweries, wineries, tequila distilleries, even some coffee companies do a whiskey barrel finish. But a huge chunk of American whiskey barrels goes right across the Atlantic to Scotland and Ireland. Those are massive whiskey producing nations that don't use new oak to get their flavor profile. They'll use used oak barrels. Same with Canada, actually, as well. Now, everything starts the same way, doesn't mean it ends the same way. There's a lot of fun with barrel finishing. Barrel finishing is when you move your whiskey from its initial barrel to a second barrel that's previously held something else. You're not adding or injecting flavor, but by moving into the second barrel and letting the aging process happen like we were just talking about, whiskey's going to go into the barrel and have a party with whatever was in that barrel beforehand and come back out having had that experience. But remember, it starts the same way. So it's got the Stranahan kind of backbone flavor profile to it. I like to think about barrel finishing like icing on a cake. It's designed to be complementary. Bring out notes that are already there inside the barley, just kind of highlight, bring them to the surface. But remember that and it starts the same way. It's got the Stranahan's backbone flavor profile to it. And we are still finishing off of last year's a bit. So this is 2024 Caribbean rum cask. This whiskey started off its life in new charred oak barrels, then was transferred into Caribbean rum barrels. We're also going down in proof a little bit, down to 90 from 94. But the primary difference you're going to taste comes from the barrel finish.
So every year Diamond Peak has a different finish.
Yeah, absolutely. So for example, the 2023 edition was a extra añejo tequila cask finish. Really cool, but very different from this one. It's going to be like herbaceous with almost a bit of agave sweetness in there. The one before that, the 2022 edition, was one of my personal favorites, the Bushmills Irish Whiskey Cask finish. And I know they bottled the 2025 one. We don't have a date for when that's going to hit the shelf yet, but sometime in the next couple of months, I would say, it will be coming out. But the main point is, if you see Diamond Peak in the local liquor store, do read the whole label. Good practice anyway, but it'll tell you on the white label the year and the barrel finish. This one says 2024 Caribbean Rum Cask. We also did not directly partner with a distillery here. We got our barrels through a third-party system called the barrel brokering system. And we were able to get barrels from several different islands in the Caribbean. Greater and Lesser Antilles, Dominican Republic, Martinique, and I'm forgetting one more, Barbados and Martinique. Yeah. So this means that Justin, our head blender, got to have a heck of a lot of fun playing with different finishing times. Some of this whiskey was in rum barrels for 6 months. Some of this whiskey was in rum barrels for 2 years. And he's able to pull from all of those different flavor profiles and give us one batch that is the best of all of them. If you were to have bought a bottle of Stranahan, say, 4 or 5 years ago, the original you would have gotten was very different from the original we have today, because when you're a younger distillery, you only have younger whiskey to play with. The original used to be 3, 4, and 5 years. That's what we had. And now it's 4 through 8 years. So if we can make our flagship product better, we're going. So these really big boys aren't technically barrels. It's a different word for them. They're called foeders. F-O-E-D-E-R. It's a Dutch word. Neat thing about these, they are not charred on the inside like a regular barrel. The oak characteristics are way more subtle and gentle. This is where Blue Peak goes. The first whiskey I gave you, after the first 4 years have been spent in new charred oak, then Blue Peak goes here. And here's where we employ that technique I mentioned at the beginning, the Solera method. As we apply it, we're going to fill one of these foeders up with at least 4-year whiskey. Some 5-year goes in as well. Let it sit for a few months. Then we're going to take out about 30% and bottle that. Then we're going to fill the foeder back up with at least 4-year whiskey. Let it sit for a few more months. Till it's just right. Take out about another 30%. Bottle that. So on and so forth. The foeder never empty. We're mingling older and younger whiskey together. But remember that it's not aging the way it would in new charred oak. So it's less about the oak influence and more about the idea of just combining those different batches together. Justin, our head blender, likes to compare it to a well-seasoned cast iron skillet. You're not adding flavor per se, you're adding a degree of character. Because we've had whiskey go in there, but it's distilled by 2 previous head distillers. And that whiskey gets absorbed into the wood, so theoretically every time you get a bottle of Blue Peak, you get a little bit of that character as well. This is what makes Blue Peak really smooth and consistent tasting, as well as the lower proof.
So if I put a 4-year barrel in there, and I've been doing this for 4 years, can I not call it an 8-year? Are you allowed to do that, or is that?
I wouldn't. We don't, honestly. So I think if we If we could, we probably would, and and we don't. So the only way that the age would go up is if we are pulling. If we start pulling like 6 and 7 year barrels and putting them in here instead of 4 and 5 year, then I would say it's older, because we're looking at time in new Chardos, because it is our foundational flavor profile for everything. That's the regular age that's how we calibrate marketing.
Okay.
And so it is like marketing thing. You could try to say it's older, but because it's not charred, like the oak you get is like way more subtle and gentle. So like the liquid is technically older, yes, but it's not aging that in a notable way. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Great answer.
Yeah. And the other thing I'll mention is like we have lots of fun with barrel finishing. My favorite barrels we ever got were the Bushmills Irish whiskey barrels I mentioned earlier. They're really cool because one thing that Bushmills does, they'll leave their barrels outside for a period of time to season in the Irish rain. What this means is the barrels are really dark and old looking, like they've been left outside in the rain. And they're stamped Bushmills on one side, but if you go and flip that very same barrel over, it says Wild Turkey or Buffalo Trace, because they're reusing bourbon barrels, usually more than once. Then we got it. We were actually the 3rd distillery in that barrel's life. Barrels can really go on of a whole international lifestyle after leaving the distillery. Machine right here. This machine doesn't actually belong to Stranahan's. Don't worry, we didn't steal it. We're holding on to it for a little company called Tin Cup. Now, Tin Cup was essentially Jess Graber's retirement project. You guys remember Jess Graber, the cowboy moonshiner guy I talked about in the beginning? He retired from Stranahan some time ago, and he did what I think of as the stereotypical retiree thing. He moved to Florida, played a whole lot of golf, and then he got bored, decided he needed a new project, so he created Tin Cup. Tin Cup is actually distilled and aged in Indiana, but it's shipped out here, and some Stranahan's is added to it. So it's not a single malt, multiple distilleries are involved. It's cut with water out here, and then it is bottled here. So this is Tin Cup's bottling machine. Stranahan's will, on occasion, use that machine. If, say, we have a really large batch coming up, a little behind on bottling by hand, well, the machine's right there. Talk just a little bit more about bottling, because a portion of Stranahan's bottling is traditionally bottled by volunteers. Now, this goes back to the very early days of our distillery, because starting a whiskey distillery is a very expensive thing to do. You don't have any whiskey to sell for several years. This is why a lot of new distilleries will start off making vodkas or gin, something that doesn't need to be barrel aged. They can turn around and make money quicker. Jess Graber didn't want to do anything like that. So when it came time to bottle that first batch of Stranahan's, he was running out of money. And he said to all 11 employees he had at the time, "Hey guys, we're gonna have a bottling party. Invite all your friends and family." And to get people excited about working for free, he set aside a barrel, cracked the barrel open, and reportedly just stuck a ladle inside it. And they say that brought them out. Those first few bottling sessions were a real wild party. But if you look at the picture in that corner, you'll see what the very, very first bottles of Stranahan's looked like. I like to point out those labels because they're very different from the labels we have now. For most of our history, we've been known for the sideways sash thing. I like to think of it as a little Miss Colorado type of action, but it's not just marketing, it's a practical purpose, because those big rectangular labels need to go on just so. And think about it a second. If you're putting all those labels on by hand, you've been drinking whiskey out the barrel, you might be struggling a little bit. We have found if you tell someone to put a label on crooked, they get it right most of the time. Practical purpose. So we've decided to continue to use some volunteer bottling to supplement our bottling fee because it's fun. It involves local community most.
My name is Devin Ershow. I am the head mixologist here for Stranahan's. That means I run the bar program for both the Denver location and the new Aspen Lounge as well. And we are here tasting our top shelf flight. All right, that starts off with our Diamond Peak whiskey. That is an annual rotating whiskey here at Stranahan, so that means it changes every year, usually around the end of spring or early summer. For now, we are still working with our Caribbean rum cask finish. All right, that is 6-year-old Stranahan's, finished anywhere from around 6 months to 3.5 years in a variety of Caribbean-style rum casks. both traditional rum and rum agricole. Do you know the difference between those two? Nobody does. Don't feel bad about yourself, all right? The thing is that all rum is made from sugar, just like all whiskey is made from grain, but most rum is made from molasses, sort of a byproduct of making sugar. Molasses is what gives rum those dark brown sugar, tropical fruit, sweet notes we tend to expect out of a rum, but rum agricole is made out of sugarcane juice. So it's going to be a little bit more grassy or vegetal in its sweetness profile since it is closer to the original agricultural source. But you're going to get a little bit of both of that in Diamond Peak. It is coming in at 90 proof. Moving on down the line, the next one in the flight is our Mountain Angel 10-year. All right, now in order to put an age statement on a bottle of whiskey, it means that the youngest whiskey involved has to be at least that age. All right, so that means you can make a 10-year-old whiskey that's got 10, 11, 15, 20-year-old barrels in it. But the second you add one 9-year barrel, it is no longer considered a 10-year whiskey. It is now 9. So this is all 10-year barrels of Stranahan's in New Oak the entire time. I like to think of it as sort of the big brother, big sister to our flagship, the original. All those same beautiful Stranahan's flavors, a little bit more delicate, a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more complex. It is coming in at 90.2 proof, which is an exceptionally weird proof, but it is what they wrote on the label. So it is what I am telling you right now. All right, don't call it 90 proof, that would be crazy. And last but certainly not least, we have Snowflake, specifically our most recent Snowflake, the Red Cloud Peak. All right, are you familiar with our Snowflake whiskeys, phone? All right, very good. So Snowflake is the most exclusive and limited release whiskey we make here at Stranahan's. So exclusive and limited release, we only sell it one day out of the year, which unless you're watching this video on the first Saturday in December, it means it's not today. All right, it's always sold on the first Saturday in December. People camp out for days to get this whiskey. It sells out in about 2 to 3 hours once we open our doors. Now, what makes Snowflake so special is every year we go into our warehouse, find some exceptional cask finish whiskeys, marry multiple cask finishes together to create something truly unique and distinctive every year, because no two snowflakes are the same, hence the name of this whiskey. All right, but I also refer to our snowflakes as the Heartbreakers, because you will inevitably fall in love with one, but you will not leave this bar with it. All right, now I've got a fun little card here. It shows the breakdown of Red Cloud Peak. We did 2 different rounds of finishing casks for this release. So you'll see the first round of finishing casks on the top. They then got rebarreled into more casks below before everything got married together to create the Red Cloud Peak, coming in at 94 proof. All right, I think this is a lovely direction in which to drink these whiskeys, from left to right. I would taste them as they are to start to get a sense of the character as they were bottled. But when you're tasting whiskey, it's always helpful to have a little dropper of water. Sometimes going back and adding a few drops helps to open the whiskey up a little bit more. All right, cheers.